within those 15 minutes, from 9 to 9:15, orders are being placed. There are many adjustments that have been taking place, and the market either opens with a gap up or a gap down. But can someone tell me, can you observe gaps on smaller time frames like 5 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe 1 hour also? Yes, rarely. Perfect. You can. Now, why? I will answer that question after some time. Alright. So let's first start with the types of gaps. Again, like a candle patterns, you have names of gaps over here. So the name of the first gap that we are looking at is a runaway gap. A runaway gap. Now by nature, by default, this gap is moderately strong. Now when I say this gap is moderately strong, it means that it can fill, but it might take 1 or 2 times. It needs to be tested once or twice before it fills. Alright? So let's see how does this gap look like. There will be an existing trend, then there will be a gap, and again the trend will continue. So such sort of a gap is known as a runaway gap, and as I said that this gap by default or by nature is moderately strong. However, we cannot just come up to a conclusion basis the nature of the gap. We will be looking at a few criteria and then we'll be determining how strong this gap is. Now, when I say how strong the gap is, I am saying if a gap is strong, it means it is more difficult to fill it. And if the gap is weak, I mean to say that it can be easily filled. So let's look at the criteria over here. The first criteria is that the gap up candle, the first gap up candle should be a wide range candle. Now what does a wide range candle mean? It means that the length of the candle including the wicks, the length of the candle including the wicks should be long. And the second,
can we say like a Marubozu?
Not necessarily a Marubozu, as I said, including the wicks. So even if there are longer wicks, it's okay. If let's say it's a doji with longer wicks, it's okay. So I need a wide range candle. And secondly, the second criteria that I need to see is that the closing should be near the high. I'm talking about an uptrend. So in an uptrend, if I see a runaway gap and I want that gap to be strong, what do I want? The first criteria is that it should be a wide range candle, and secondly, the closing of the candle should be near its high. That means a good buyer's candle. Fair enough? So if these two criteria is fulfilled, then the gap becomes a little stronger, and it needs to test multiple times before it breaks. Is this point clear to all? Yes or no in chat, please. Is this point clear to all?
Sir, can you thoda repeat yourself?
All right. See, a runaway gap is by default moderately strong. And if I want to say that the gap should be even more strong, that means the gap will take a lot of time to fill, or at least a couple of times it needs to test before it fills. So what all criteria do I have to look at? I have to look at the first gap up candle. Now in that first gap up candle, what are the criteria? It should be a wide range candle. A wide range candle means the length of the candle should be long, including the wick. And secondly, the closing of the candle should be near the high. If these two criteria are fulfilling, it means that the gap becomes a little bit more stronger, and we might want a couple of times of testing before the gap fills. Is this point clear now? So if it's a strong candle or if it's a strong gap, then I won't immediately short over here. I will come at the gap order and probably I can think of a different strategy. I know that it might not immediately fill, it's just testing one time, might come back up again and then fill the gap. Similarly, in an existing downtrend, There's an existing downtrend, there is a gap, and again the market continues, or there's a trending market. So again, such sort of a gap is known as a runaway gap. Speaking of the criteria, again the first criteria is the same. The first gap down candle should be a wide range candle. That means the length of the candle should be long, including the wick. Now speaking of the second criteria, now tell me, should the closing be near the high or should the closing be near the low? If I want the gap to be strong.
Near the low.
Near the low. So the closing should be near the low. If I want the candle to be a little, if I want the gap to be a little strong. So if these two criteria fulfill, the gap becomes even stronger, and it might test a couple of times before it fills the gap. So let's take a look at a few examples. One of the examples is on Infosys day chart. I want you all to mark the examples for your reference point of view. Alright. Now what is happening over here? Market is in an uptrend. Alright. After that we see a gap. So what sort of a gap is this? A runaway gap. As simple as that. Now let's talk about the criteria. The first gap up candle. Is this a wide range candle? Yes or no? Is this a wide range candle, the first gap up candle? Wide range candle. Matlab, is the length long, including the wick? Yes, it is. Now speaking of the second criteria, are we getting the closing near the high? No. So what is happening? Is the gap strong? Is it becoming stronger? No. So what has happened? Let's observe. Markets went up briefly, came down, tested this level once, went back up again. Now what did it do? It made a lower high, came down, filled the gap, and from there again the markets reversed. Are you all getting this logic? Now why did this gap fill over here? Because this was a runaway gap first, and secondly, the criteria weren't fulfilling. The first criteria was fulfilling, that it was a wide range candle, but the second criteria, that the closing near the highs, was not fulfilling. So what happened? Markets briefly went up, came down, made a lower high, filled the gap, and then the markets continued its rally on the upside. If you all closely observe, the RSI उस टाइम पे अपने एक सपोर्ट लेवल पे था. Support, gap filled, got a doji, got a confirmation, and markets have rallied from there. Alright, let's take one more example. Again, we observe the same thing. Markets were in an uptrend, and we see a gap up. Now tell me, why hasn't this gap filled? Because it's forming a very similar picture to this gap over here. But why hasn't this gap filled over here? What could be the possible reasons?
Great earnings, as you can see below.
Forget about the earnings. Let's talk about the chart directly.
Sir, round number resistance, the support is there, 900.
Okay, one point could be that. Secondly,
Sir,
RSI support पे है. RSI support पे है.
volume is too high.
RSI support पे नहीं है. यहाँ पे RSI is in its bot zone.
Volume is also too high.
Volume is nothing related to volumes over here.
First candle is not closing is not above.
Closing is not है तो fulfill होना चाहिए था. Gap fill हो जाना चाहिए था. Gap fill क्यों नहीं हुआ है?
Not every gap gets filled, na?
But why? In this case, why?
It was earning or result something.
Doesn't matter. Earnings and all doesn't matter. Chart क्या कह रहा है वो देखो.
Lower low for higher high formation was there.
Higher high was over here also. This high was created. After that, lower high बना था वो ठीक है. But पहले तो इसने एक high बनाया था यहाँ पे. Strong bullish sentiment, no. चलो, I'll do one thing. I'll just mark one more thing on the chart. Then let's try to observe. It hasn't filled later. It hasn't filled later.
Maybe it has become a breakaway gap.
No.
The round number strong support around 900.
That is one thing, but there is one more thing over here.
Is it a consolidation breakout?
No. I'll tell you what is happening. Now closely try to observe. This is a very small technical point. Perfect, Avan. Perfect. So what is happening over here is, again there was a runaway gap. The first candle was a wide range candle, in fact even better than the previous example. However, the closing wasn't near the high. So technically it should have filled the gap. So now what is happening is, the markets did come down, but did it test this level? Did it test the lows over here? Let me give you a perspective in a very layman's language. Let's say if there is a wall built of leaves, we know that that wall is pretty weak since it's made out of leaves. But to break that wall, don't you have to touch it? Don't you have to test it once at least? यहाँ पे बताओ, are the markets testing these lows? Are the markets testing this gap level? Yes or no? Logic समझ आ रहा है? What I'm trying to say? Yes, of course.
Yeah,
There is
yes,
a round
yes.
number 900 level. I agree. That is one point. But what is an additional point? The additional point is the level itself is not being tested. If the level itself is not being tested, then how will the gap be filled? Are you all getting the point? So this is the difference between the two examples. So this is around the 16 July 2020, this example on Infosys day chart. And over here, this was around 8th October 2020. Over here, you can see the level was tested. That is why it came up, formed that lower high, came and filled the gap.
In Himalay, what is a runaway rally? Like this is a runaway gap. Like we witnessed in Nifty runaway rally during the presidential elections in US. That was a runaway rally, right?
It was a runaway gap only. It's a runaway gap that was around, I think, 12,500 or some odd levels. I'll tell you. I'll show it on the chart. It's the same thing. You basically get a confirmation. Same
Even in Nifty also, from 18,000 to 18,600, a small runaway rally.
You just use alternate terms for the same thing. Let me just find that. Over here, there was a breakaway gap. I'll teach you the breakaway gap, but after that, you can see this was a runaway gap. Criteria are fulfilling. That's why the gap hasn't been filled. After that, immediately again a runaway gap. Criteria are fulfilling. The gap hasn't been filled. So on and so forth. There was a rally after that. Might have been the case around the 18,000 thing that you have been speaking of.
In last year, October, around October, a small runaway rally, 2-3 days only.
Same thing over here. Getting the point? Your criteria is fulfilling, gap becomes strong, it's not fulfilling. After that, एक top बन गया market का, then the market entirely reversed. Then it got filled. It's not that it just filled and then continued the rally. Over here, the structure itself, the entire market structure has reversed. Or the sentiment itself has reversed. I think
So runaway rally and runaway gaps are like the same thing only.
Yeah, more or less it's the same thing.
Okay.
Alright. So this was the first type of gap, known as a runaway gap. Now let's come to the second type, which is known as a breakaway gap. Now by default, or by nature, this gap is a very strong gap. It usually takes a lot of time to fill this gap. Sometimes it doesn't even fill. Now how does this look like? Let's say there will be an existing uptrend. However, it will first get into some sort of a consolidation, or in other terms, there will be a resistance level. Now the breakout is happening in form of a gap. So such sort of a gap is known as a breakaway gap. If your breakout is happening in form of a gap, it is known as a breakaway gap. However, again, we won't just simply rely on the nature of the gap. We will look at the criteria as well. The first criteria again being, the first gap up candle should be a wide range candle, or in other terms, it should be a long candle including the wick. And the second criteria is that the closing should be near the highs to make the gap even more stronger. Similarly, in an existing downtrend, there will be a support and the breakdown will happen in form of a gap. Again, the criteria is the same. The first candle should be a wide range candle. The second candle, you should get a closing near the lows to make this gap even more stronger. So again, let's take an example. Take gap I just showed you. So over here, if you see what is happening, Nifty was around its 12,000 levels, a good a good resistance level. Now what is happening over here? Market came, resistance level, breakout happened in form of what? A breakaway gap. So again over here we had covered this on YouTube as well. There was a breakaway gap. As I said, the criteria are fulfilling. This is not as wide a candle as we would have wanted, but we are getting a closing near the highs, indicating a good buyer's market. And after that you can see neither the levels has been tested, and thus that gap has never been filled ever since. So this is what I was talking about. Some gaps never fill, and that is your breakaway gaps usually. Apart from the consolidation, not much of a difference. Perfect. There's no difference apart from that consolidation, or in other terms, a resistance or a support level. I'll show you one more example. It's on TCS. Alright, now tell me what sort of a gap is this? Is this a runaway gap or is this a breakaway gap?
Breakaway gap.
Is everyone sure that this is a breakaway gap?
Runaway.
Alright, so again we have a mixed decision over here. This is not your runaway gap, this is your breakaway gap. Resistance level hai. Resistance level hai. The breakout is happening in form of a gap. Try to understand. That becomes a breakaway gap and not a runaway gap. I understand you're considering this as a rally, but overall try to understand the picture. This is your resistance level. Time and again market has held the ground over here around your 2500 round number levels as well, and then the breakout happened in form of a gap. Now speaking of the criteria, the first criteria, is this a wide range candle? Is this a wide range candle? Yes or no? Yes.
Yeah.
Are we getting the closing near the highs? Yes. So the gap now becomes even more strong. So now you can see further later on, this level has been tested multiple times. As far as I remember, this level has been tested around 10 to 15 times if you count. Still, the gap has not been filled. That is how strong of a gap a breakaway gap is. It usually takes a lot of effort and a lot of pressure to fill a breakaway gap. Is this point clear to all?
Himalay, can you repeat the next point, please?
What I am trying to say is the criteria are fulfilling. So firstly, this is a breakaway gap. So by nature, this is already a strong gap. Secondly, the criteria are also fulfilling, making it an even stronger gap. So now what is happening is, despite the market testing this